Yes, hello. My name's Joe Moran. I'm one of the lecturers in English at John Moores, and Frank and Sonny, who've organised this whole series on national identity, have asked me to introduce tonight's speaker, Stuart Maconie, which I'm delighted to do. I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room for whom Radcliffe and Maconie has been a comforting daily ritual. Over the last few years on Radio 2 in the evenings and now on 6 Music in the afternoons. In fact, we're quite honoured because Stuart has cut short his appearance on this afternoon's show, so the last 20 minutes were Radcliffe without Maconie, so he could come talk to us tonight. But I'm sure that you know that part of Stuart's career as a radio presenter and TV presenter, music critic, biographer of Blur and the Manchester band James, writer for the NME for many years. He seems to have been someone who's been in the right place at the right time at lots of key moments in our popular culture over the last few decades. He was a northern soul boy in Wigan. I was brought up in Wigan in the 70s, in the capital of northern soul. He was a student of English at Edge Hill College, not very far from here, in the early 80s, and a frequenter of Eric's, a famous Liverpool club where Echo and the Bunnymen and Teardrop Explodes and all those bands originated. And he wasn't only around at the birth of Britpop as a writer for the NME, but he's widely attributed with having invented the name Britpop. And shouldn't forget his great contributions to urban mythology at the NME as well. The urban myths that Bob Holness, the presenter of Blockbusters, played saxophone on Jerry Rafferty's Baker Street, and that David Bowie invented the game Connect 4, which really wish those things were true, but unfortunately they're not. Over the last few years, and I'm sure you know about this as well, Stuart's had another career as an author of more broad-ranging books, which very appropriately for this series are really about national identity, or perhaps especially about the relationship between national and regional identity. A book about the North as an idea as well as a region, Pies and Prejudice, with its contentious theory that the North begins at Crewe Station. A book about that quasi-mythological place, Middle England, Adventures on the High Tees, and his latest book, Hope and Glory, The Days That Made Britain, which is all about key moments, key dates in our national history over the last 100 years, and I think Stuart's going to talk about some of those things tonight. And those books have been deservedly popular because they're written with great wit and great warmth, but I think they're also written with quite a lot of scholarship and erudition. They certainly show very wide reading across lots of different strands of our culture, from Julian Cope to George Orwell, from Morrissey to W.H. Auden. And it's very difficult to do that, to bring those different strands of culture together. So I'm very admiring of people who can do it. And so I'm very much looking forward to his talk tonight, and I hope you will join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Stuart Maconie.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you, Frank, and thank you for asking me here to speak to you this evening, which we'll have some scholarship in, as Joe was very kind enough to mention, but will perhaps not be a formal and academic lecture. Some of you may be disappointed, and some of you may be delighted to learn. I'm going to talk mainly about my new book, Hope and Glory, 10 days drawn from the 20th century that I think had a shaping effect on Britain and how we live and where we live now. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, though, because it's possible when people don't know what my background and backstory is. Quite briefly, I come from Wigan. I'm a woolly back from Wigan. Taught at SKEM College for about 4 years. I graduated in the worst year ever for graduate unemployment, which is fantastic poor timing. I think you'll agree. We shan't go into whose fault that was. I then worked at SKEM College for several years. I worked at the Cotton Mill and I worked at SKEM College for several years, which I loved. I taught English and sociology to 18 to 60-year-olds there and loved that. And I used to regularly upset my colleagues at the NME from my first couple of years at NME by saying, this job's nothing like as rock and roll as my last one, you know. You want to teach 20-year-olds in Tannos now, that's a wild job, you know. Saw a documentary in which the editor of the NME said, we read everything that comes into this office, but most of it is rubbish. I took him at his word that they read stuff, and I sent them, on a whim, I sent them a review of Edwin Collins, the great Edwin Collins, and got a letter back by return of post. Remember that, this is when we're talking. We're not talking like, it sounds like we're talking in the Middle Ages to get a letter back, doesn't it? But, do you want a job? Letter from James Brown, not the godfather of soul, James Brown, but the James Brown who later went on to form Loaded magazine and who then got himself sacked as the editor of FHM magazine for putting the Nazis at number 8 in the 200 best dressed men ever. A contentious argument, some would say. Yeah, got a job. For a little while did both jobs, which was rather difficult. Teaching in SKEM in the day and being the NME's kind of northern correspondent by night. It came to a head when I was in the class one day, and forgive me if you've read my books, which I'm very grateful for, you may find some of these stories rather familiar. I can't promise anything other than the minor pleasure of hearing me say them out loud. Janet, the school secretary, came to the front of a class where I was teaching them about Durkheim and Marx and said, can you go and get a phone call? There's a phone call for you from a Mr. James Brown. And I said, well, can you tell him to wait? I am teaching a class. And she said, well, he's very persistent. He says, he wants you to go, this is a Friday afternoon, he wants you to go to Seattle on Monday to interview In Excess and Michael Hutchence. And I looked out as the thin drizzle fell over the concourse. And the kids in the class said, they said, you've got to take that call. I won't do the accent because I'm here now. So they said, you've got to take that call. And I went and took the call, came back, and went to Seattle on Monday. Well, I went to my head of department first, a man called Tony Bryant, lovely man, who was clearly an old hippie who used to read the NME, and he basically said, yeah, go and have 4 days off and go and do it. I did it, and I never really went back, as you can imagine. I'll tell you a little story about Tony Bryant that's got nothing to do with anything. It's just one of my favourite stories ever. When he was a student, he was coming home to Blackpool North, to Blackpool, where he lived. And as students are wont to do, he'd saved up all his dirty washing and stuff for the end of term, you know, to take home to his mum in a huge 70s duffel bag. Had a load of luggage, sitting on the train, the conductor came around to look at his ticket, and he said, what time do we get into Blackpool North? The conductor said, we don't stop at Blackpool North. He said, what? He said, we don't stop at Blackpool North. He said, we slow down. He said, but we don't stop. He says, it doesn't stop there. So he says, it slows down though. A young fella like you, he said, you could probably jump off. Now this has been the days before health and safety took hold. Right, I'll give it a go. Throws his bag out, firstly, because he thinks I've got this system, it slows down a little more. Waits, thinks this is pretty slow. Throws the big duffel bag of clothes out. It slows down a little bit more, and he thinks, now, is it going to get any slower than this? Got him to make this mental thing. And it's not going to get any slower than this, I'm sure. Jumps. Falls really heavily and awkwardly on the platform, rolls over, causing great consternation amongst all the people who wait for the train. And the train stops, and everyone gets off. And later on, if we have some questions, remind me to ask me about The Fall and Mark Riley. Because what I love about that story is whether the conductor is acting out of ignorance or sheer malice, sheer desire to mess with his head, you know. And Mark Riley tells a great story. Mark Riley, my colleague at Six Music, used to be in The Fall, the band The Fall, tells a brilliant similar story about The Fall, which I will tell you later, if you ask me. Right, so we hastily come to the present day. I write books. This is my new book. Thank you for mentioning it. It came straight from the radio show. I'm a little tired. Gok Wan, who's also on the circuit at the moment, and with the same publisher, Gok Wan is doing the rounds with his book and his book of the TV series. And as I have said to Gok Wan, a book that would suit me better, Gok, and would be more useful to me It's how to look good knackered. So I apologise if I feel a little. I'm sure we can get through the next hour, though, and then it'll be wine o'clock. When I used to teach sociology in STEM, I was a young Marxist perspective. If you've done sociology, you'll know that there's different perspectives in sociology. Marxist ethnomethodologist type tutor who used to say to them, news, when you watch the news, people like the Glasgow Media Group would say, you watch the news and it's presented to you that news is a succession of high-profile events, strikes, beheadings, revolutions, and this is how news progresses. And I say, this is wrong. This is the lie that news tells you. This is wrong. News and our world is shaped by slow cultural forces that go on behind the scenes all the time, economics and science and politics. But that's not as sexy, but that's the way the news really works, and they never tell you about that. They never give you the proper background. So with apologies to all those kids I taught, my new book is about 10 unashamedly sexy and sensational days in British history. And I'm going to whiz through the 10, well not whiz, over the next 50 minutes or so, talk through the 10, and gives me a chance to talk about football, women, strikes, Tony Blair, Live Aid, celebrity and things like that. The first 3 chapters of the book, on the surface of it, a bit gloomy. But we'll try and, but if you do read the book, you'll find that I have shoehorned in, skillfully woven into the narrative, humour and jokes. So don't be put off reading it when you find out that the first 3 chapters are going backwards, the general strike, the Battle of the Somme, and the death of Queen Victoria. There she is. Queen Victoria had the misfortune to live and die in the very early days, the infancy of photography, when you had to sit. She was sitting there for about 25 minutes probably while a man in a black tarpaulin cape over his head, stood next to her. That's why she always looked so miserable. She actually wasn't a miserable kid at all. She was quite a feisty, quick kid, quite a fun-loving kid. Do you know that she was the first person in Britain to be called Victoria? We think of Victoria as being utterly emblematic of Britishness now, don't we? What could be more English than the name Victoria? First person in England to be called Victoria. It was like being called Björk. It was like being called Lady Gaga. It was a continental absurdity being called Victoria. What kind of name's that? And that just shows you how she was never intended to become queen. She becomes queen through a variety of things that you can read about in the book. But she was a feisty kid who, although her mother and her mother's advisor, John Conroy, didn't want Victoria to be queen, she wanted to be queen, and she set about getting her hands on the throne and keeping it as quickly as she could. One of the ways she did that is by marrying Prince Albert. Now, I imagine this will only make sense to half of you, but I want to say it anyway. Prince Albert, it's not true. Okay, now let's move on. Prince Albert, if you go and see the portraits of him in Osborne House in the Isle of Wight, where they used to hang out and where I went to for this book, if you go and see the portraits of him, 17% charge. There's now an element of danger creeping in. Will I get through it before the iPad goes off, do you think? Oh, there's a plug there. It's not going to be quite as exciting as I imagined. He was. The Radio Times often say about certain kinds of character actor, not conventionally attractive. That was Prince Albert for you. He looked a little bit like a horse with the world's first revolutionary comb-forward haircut. But Victoria, to use the parlance that you young people use, thought he was buff, fit, and wanted to get jiggy with him. She loved him, and she took it very, very badly when he died. She wore black for the rest of her life. She had his shaving water drawn and brought to the bedroom every morning. She didn't appear in public for 2 years, and when she did appear in public after 2 years, it was only to unveil a statue of Prince Albert. Now, again, I like in my books to sort of slightly challenge conventional wisdom, the things that get handed down as kind of everyone knows that. And everyone knows that everyone loved Victoria, and she was the much-loved matriarch of Britain. But after a year or two of this weird, self-imposed mourning, people began to think, at first they thought it was touching and lovely, but then they began to think it was creepy and weird. The Times of London actually published a leader article that basically boiled down to, pull yourself together, ma'am, this is getting a bit creepy and weird, and everyone's beginning to laugh at us. Those words to that effect. She was furious. There were 8 assassination attempts on her life. Did you know that? 8 assassination attempts on her life. Admittedly, they were 8 of the most mental and incompetent assassination attempts in the history of assassination, the most mental and incompetent being done by a man called Mr. Bean, who loaded tobacco and paper into his gun before he shot her. One of them was a teenage boy who was thwarted by Victoria hitting him on the head with an umbrella. But there were 8 attempts on her life. But she wasn't universally liked, and she didn't like everyone. When she went through Manchester, and I guess in Liverpool this is going to go down very well, when she went through Manchester, she used to pull the curtain of her carriage down, so she didn't have to look at the oiks and the ugly buildings there in Manchester. I'm not sure if she felt any better disposed towards Liverpool. She also didn't like the suffragettes much, and this is the real point of my first chapter. She said the suffragettes ought to be horsewhipped, and the suffragettes in their turn didn't think much of Victoria. They were quite a feisty bunch themselves, the suffragettes, because of Mary Poppins. Yes, I get most of my cultural capital from the films of Julie Andrews. Because of Mary Poppins, I grew up thinking the suffragettes were a group of people with placards, ladies in crinoline who said, you know, the placards read, "Dear Mr. Asquith, if it's not too much trouble, could I have the vote?" In fact, they were terrorists. They were full-on political terrorists. I mean, terrorism, maybe putting it strong, they were certainly full-on political activists. Here's some of the things they did. Emmeline Pankhurst said, the only serious argument in politics is the argument of the broken window. And they broke a lot of windows. They did more than that. They tried to burn down Aintree Racecourse. They tried to burn down the All England Club at Wimbledon, the tennis, place. They tried to burn down Preston North End's ground at Deepdale. I'm a Wigan Athletic supporter. I entirely approve of that. They tried to blow up Lloyd George's holiday home. They blew up Lord Lever's holiday home at Rivington Pike near Wigan. They attacked Asquith and his cabinet on the golf course. And most famously of all, most famous bit of sporting terrorism they did, Emily Davidson threw herself in front of the King's Horse at the 1906, I'll check that, Derby. She didn't intend to kill herself, though, which is evidenced by the fact, we know this, she was evidenced by the fact that, well, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes, she had a return ticket and a ticket to a suffragette dance that evening in her pocket. So clearly, but, it was still an extraordinarily unsafe thing to do, and it led to her dying. But the jockey, by the way, never got over that, never got over it, gassed himself in 1951, but, interestingly, converted to the suffragette cause, became a wholehearted supporter of the suffragettes, and laid flowers at her and Pankhurst's funerals. They got what they wanted in the end, chiefly due to what happens next in the next chapter. Swiss women had to wait till 1971 to get the vote. Isn't that amazing? 1971 before Switzerland got the vote. But before we get all thinking how progressive we are still 48th in the list of countries in the world with the most women MPs. Iran and Rwanda are higher up that list than us. They have more women MPs than us. Okay, after the side-splitting Victoria's death chapter, if you can, oh my aching sides, the Battle of the Somme. The First World War is why they got the vote, really, because the government was too preoccupied with stuff abroad to keep worrying about these terrorists at home. And they, for their part, kind of reined back on their activities as well because of the war. And then were given the vote at the end of the war. I wanted to do this because I wanted to riff a bit on England and war. If I can read you a bit from the book. England and war. It's kind of what we do. Fighting is as English as farming. It's an industry as traditional as forge or field or foundry. And war is a product as solidly, dependably English as Wensleydale or Worcester or Wedgwood. Our other traditional industries may have shriveled to nothing through neglect or contempt, mining, steel, textiles, but warcraft remains, prospers even. The last few decades have been boom years for warcraft. Look back into your family. You may not find policemen, but you will find soldiers. My dad was one briefly. Your dad, your granddad, your brother, your uncle may well have been one as well through conscription or national service, which have woven war and soldiery into our national psyche. We've got books about it, sitcoms about it, dramas about it, songs about it, films about it. Look back in that family album and you'll find pictures of your uncle or your dad or your granddad or your great uncle in a big daft hat and big daft shorts in somewhere like the various places that we've had plenty of practice in. India, Palestine, Malaya, Korea, Kenya, Cyprus, Suez, Borneo, Vietnam, Aden, Oman, Dhofar, Northern Ireland, the Falklands, the Gulf, Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Afghanistan, even to the 1970s, when it's received wisdom again is that most people were interested mainly in chopper bikes and spangles and Felicity Kendall's delectable bottom. We managed a war of sorts, a war with the Icelandic Navy over our inalienable birthright of a cod and chips supper, the Cod War. Our national anthem is a very good example. Other countries, take the Austrians, they sing about mountains and rivers and the beauty of the Austrian landscape. Or Thunder Dragons, as the Bhutanese national anthem is about. Or the lightning over the Tatras Mountains, that's the Slovakian national anthem. Ours is basically Oi, Prussia, outside in the car park now. And then goes on to be full of confounding our foes, scattering them, military victory. There's nothing about the Lake District, there's nothing about the Cotswolds, there's nothing about fudge or anything. The blood a hero's sire hath spent still nerves a hero's son, which you never hear that verse at the proms, because it gets grislier and grislier, and because nerves, I don't think, is a verb. But the Battle of the Somme kind of signifies the crucible of war and what it's meant to our country. Here's how to get a flavour of the immensity of the horror of the Battle of the Somme, and why I wanted to write about it in terms of how it's had an effect on our country. When I was writing this book, Gordon Brown got into trouble. Do you remember him? Gordon Brown got into trouble because he hand-wrote a letter of consolation to a lady called Jane Jones who's had a son killed in Afghanistan, and he put some spelling mistakes in it on purpose, of course. There's some spelling mistakes in it, and it was badly written, and he was accused of being disrespectful to the war dead. Now, there were no letters of consolation sent to anyone, any mothers of the fallen at the Battle of the Somme, chiefly because, had he been Prime Minister then, Gordon Brown would have had to write 19,240 letters within the first hour of the battle. It's just not comparable to anything that happens in this day and age. I went to Wootton Bassett for this book, and you see one coffin in a cortege, and of course that is sad and that's terribly moving, but the numbers involved these days are immensely. William and Julia Souls of Great Rissington in Gloucestershire lost all 5 of their sons on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So that's why I wanted to write about it. Again, if your aching sides can stand it, the general strike of 1926. Now, unless you're a poet or a priest, or like Morrissey, you've never had a job because you're too shy, you've probably been on strike. I've been on strike in every job I've ever had. Now, I realise when I say that, it starts to look like I'm the pattern that links them all, doesn't it? It starts to think the pattern's emerging because of me. I've been on strike in every job I've ever had. I've been on strike as in a cot, I've been on strike as a textile worker, I've been on strike as a teacher. I didn't cross a picket line a few weeks ago, a Beck 2 picket line at the BBC for the radio. And, of course, the most famous of all, and the one that will be burned into your memory, is the great NME strike of 1992, when the nation trembled on the lip of anarchy, when the nation wondered, would it ever get its Happy Mondays features? Would it ever get those on-the-road pieces on Ned's atomic dustbin? Quivered on the edge of anarchy. The NME strike failed. I was about 24 when I went to work for the NME. I was the only one there who had anything loosely resembling a proper job before I went. And so I'm slightly more expert on industrial relations than other people there. Proprietor of Reed Publications, one Michael Heseltine. I don't think he's going to be willing to pay us all to go on trips around the world while we're on strike. Just my idea. And of course he wasn't. And when that news filtered around, the strike collapsed. Back in 1926, though, there really was a moment when people thought that it was going to all kick off. Trotsky and Stalin both came to Britain in 1926 to oversee and be involved in what they thought would be the English Revolution. Don't forget, it's only 9 years. 9? Yeah, 9 years after the Russian Revolution. We were next. Marx thought we were next. Trotsky, Stalin thought we're next. And it got quite hairy at times. I, in the book, go to a place called Cramlington in Northumberland. Now, Cramlington is now mainly famous for being where Alan Shearer played schoolboy football, the birthplace of Ross Noble, the comedian, and it's where Sting, the smackable lutenist, did his teaching practice. In 1926, striking miners in Cramlington derailed the Flying Scotsman. Derailed it. Most famous passenger train in the world. Derailed it with paving stones. Went to prison for between 8 and 10 years. It got quite hairy, the general strike, but it didn't work. It ultimately failed in its attempt to bring down the government. And anyway, but in this book, in this chapter of the book, I go not just to the individual places, but to places associated with the strike. So I go to Orgreave, And I looked at a lot of footage of the miners' strike, which is extraordinary. If you've not looked back at footage of the miners' strike for a while, do look. It doesn't look like Britain. It looks like another country. It looks like Chechnya or Bosnia. Or you see armed, not armed, but you see police stopping cars, roadblocks. It's astonishing. It doesn't look like England at all now. Okay, let's be a little more cheery, shall we? Let's move on. Let's have a laugh before we... 1936, first night of BBC television, which I grew up with. I think a lot of you here grew up with. I grew up with Thunderbirds. I grew up with the Jerry and Sylvia Anderson stuff. I grew up with Rent-A-Ghost. It's funny how we're affectionate about that stuff now. A young American friend of mine was asking me, I mentioned Thunderbirds the other day, and she said, what's Thunderbirds? I said, I'll show it you on YouTube. And I showed it, and I was like, oh, look at that, Thunderbirds. I said, what do you think of that? She said, I think that's the creepiest thing I've ever seen. And then when you look at it newly, you think, yeah, it is a bit weird, isn't it? All the heads are wrong, you know. But television... I am a radio person and I'm a writer, really. I do television, particularly while my agent's here. I shouldn't be saying that I don't want to do any more television. But to me, given the world, you know, if you've been a writer and if you've worked on the radio, television is so enormously palaverous. So, I mean, every television product, when we go on the radio during the day, basically we pick the records and we pick the guests, but after that, what happens when we go into that room and open those mics? Pretty much anything can happen. Then there's, you know, the level of preparation from that point of view is fairly minimal. We have a team of about 4. Some of you will say, yeah, and it shows, mate. I know, we'll talk, hold that thought. Television, every television program's got about this room full of people working on it, no matter how rubbish and trivial a television program is. Layers and layers of people whose job is never fully explained to you, you know. Young blokes called Jamie, who seems solely to be there to bring you cups of tea. Tall, willowy girls called Chloe, with backpacks and earphones and walkie-talkies and crackling walkie-talkies that she has an expression on her face all the time of kind of dreamy reverie, as if everything you're saying to her is but transporting her with delight. In fact, someone in her ear is saying, can you get Eamon Holmes out of the green room and into makeup? Television is, let me give you some examples of how palaverous the world of television is. Mark Steele, friend of mine, comedian. He and I were appearing on a show once, and there was a dress rehearsal, it was a panel show, and at the end of the lineup, Mark was there, and they said, and finally, would you welcome from Radio 2's Mark Steele Solution, Mark Steele. Fine. And Mark said, just one thing, if you could just, it's Radio 4's Mark Steele Solution. It's not a big thing, but it's just Radio 4's Mark Steele Solution. And the tall, willowy girl called Chloe looked ashen-faced and went, oh dear, I think the writers have gone home. It's absolutely true. Everything's got to be looked at, sent to the executive producer. No one was willing to just make that change, like just change that 2 to a 4. Another example that I think I mentioned in the book of the palaverous nature of television. I was once interviewing a film director who made a film called Tonight Let's All Make Love in London, which is about the psychedelic scene in Britain. I was interviewing him in Camden. And when the interview finished, it all gone very well, and my director said to me, the problem is, Stuart, you can hear the underground trains rumbling through every now and again on the Northern Line. You're going to have to make a reference to it, because otherwise people will find it very distracting and odd. So I inserted this really weird line, like, well, Peter, your film's influence continues to rumble on, rather like the Northern Line trains that we've heard during this interview. Yes, it wasn't brilliant, it wasn't elegant. But when they got back to the studio, you couldn't hear any trains. And so now what you've got is me just saying this completely random and mental thing at the end of the interview. And so they went to the gramophone library of the BBC and they got out sound effects discs of Northern Line trains and they dubbed some back on. That's what television is like. Conversely, radio, they'll say to you, speak as if you're only speaking to one other person. Well, I have worked on programs where that's all too easy to do, believe me. Because if you opened the microphone and thought to yourself, as when I've done shows like the Radio 2 Breakfast Show, the Radio 2 Drive Time Show, imagine Wembley Stadium full to the brim of people. Then imagine 85 of those. That's how many people are listening. Nothing would come out of your mouth except a kind of bat squeak of terror. Although that would still be more entertaining than talk sport, I think. Television is kind of woven like national service and like into the kind of warp and weft of our national identity. Radio is more popular, but it's a much more intimate medium. It took me a while to realize why there's no Play Misty for me for television presenters. and why the fan mail radio presenters get is so much odder than the fan mail television presenters get. Because no matter how keen or stroke deluded you are, when you're watching Simon Cowell or Lorraine Kelly or Alan Titchmarsh, you know he's in a radio studio, a television studio. You know there's lights, there's people. You know that it's an artifice. It took me a while to realise that when I'm on the radio, my voice, well, I could be in the bath with you. I could be in bed with you. I could be in the car with you. I could be in the garden with you. I could be in a tent in a remote Scottish valley with you. It's a much, much more intimate medium. And that's why you get much weirder fan mail and you get Play Misty for me, I think. But I do television. And in terms of a kind of national, bringing it, I suppose, back loosely to national identity, television is something we all share, an iconography we all share. Twice in my life, I felt that I have fallen into the television set. Once was when I did Have I Got News For You? You've all heard that music so often. You've all been there watching it. There's the animation, there's Paul Merton, there's Ian Hislop. I felt like the kid in Poltergeist that had fallen into the television. Television also, by the way, I should have mentioned, has a different language of its own as well. As I mentioned in Pies and Prejudice, one that first did television, the director of it, the producer of it, a lady called Elaine, said to me, we should talk about you doing more television things. She lived in Chiswick. I don't know why that's relevant, but I mentioned it. And she said, why don't you pop round one evening for supper and we'll talk about it? And I said, well, won't your husband mind if I come round in my dressing gown at 10:30 in the evening to have digestive biscuits and cheese? Because that's what I call supper. I soon realised that TV people mean something entirely different by supper. It's a posh meal you have at night. The second time I felt like I did Celebrity Mastermind, 20th century British poetry I did on Celebrity Mastermind. Again, it's one of those things, the chair, the music, a kind of national iconography. Well, the fact that it's part of our national iconography is evidenced by the fact that when they said to me in the dressing room beforehand, where they take it very seriously, are you familiar with the format of Mastermind? I said, yeah, everyone's familiar with the format of Mastermind. And they basically said, just answer the questions. You know, are you familiar with the format? And I realized this is serious, isn't it? They said, if you've got a challenge immediately. We can't take any challenges unless you challenge immediately. You must say that answer's wrong. And I said, okay. I said, but that never happens. I've never seen that happen. I've been watching Mastermind for years. That never happens. And they said, no, we edit those bits out, Stuart. I thought, yeah, of course you do. And then they said to me, there has never been a correct challenge in the history of Mastermind. Which was kind of like, you know, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, Stuart. So I didn't bother. It's just apropos of nothing. When I did Mastermind, my mum rang me 2 days later and said, were you on that Celebrity Mastermind programme? I said, yeah. She said, yeah, Doreen and the hairdresser said you were. And we had to do it for charity, I should have said. And I gave my money to Specsavers, who do good work about eyesight and eye handicap in the third world. She said, did you do that? I said, yeah. She said, why did you give the money to Specsavers? Did I say Specsavers then? That was my mum's mistake. I did it for Sightsavers. That's even better. I did it for Sightsavers. My mum rang me up and said, why did you give the money to Specsavers? Yeah, she said, oh, well, yeah, I should have all remembered that bit. She said, your dad paid £125 for 2 pairs of glasses. They've got enough money at Specsavers. Chapter 5 is about, and at the end, if you want to ask me, like, because I know some of my books I talk about national identity in a broader sense than only this book. So at the end, if you want to ask me anything about any of the books or anything I do, that's fine. Docking of the Empire Windrush, massively important. 1948, Docking of the Empire Windrush, first wave of Commonwealth immigration to Britain. I picked this day because this is kind of one of the most polemical chapters in the book where I really get on a kind of soapbox about modern Britain and the fact that we are a multicultural society. Not only are we a multicultural society, we've been a mongrel race since day one, composed of successive waves of Jews, Huguenots, Romans. This is not chronological, by the way. Celts, Vikings, Normans. My granny who talked like this, who came from Wigan, her maiden name was Molyneux, which it took me a while to realize she was a Norman. She came with William the Conqueror. We are, all of us, we are a mongrel nation, and it is as well to get that sorted out now. And I also, people who talk about a national identity and a purity of national spirit, well, the thing I always think is, as opposed to our mongrel mixed race Britain of now, I always think it's really laughable, that, because I always think, I don't really ever see Leona Lewis or Theo Walcott looking at Nick Griffin and saying, "Now, there's an example of racial purity and fine physique and health." You know what I mean? It's such an appalling, ridiculous idea. And this is an unashamedly polemical chapter where I talk about the fact that whether you're from Chorley or Lahore, we are a multicultural Britain, we are a mongrel nation. Get with the program. I did a documentary in the Lake District. I talked to a head teacher there, and I said, "Are most of your kids off-comers? You know, do they come, is it families of people who come from the tourist industry and stuff like that?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "But we've got a few Burkitts, Stuart. We've got a few Lanthrigs. We've got a few Lanthwaits. We've got a few good Viking names." And I'd say, "I think you will find the Vikings were off-comers. I think you'll find that they came in big ships, you know, from Scandinavia, and burned and pillaged and stuff like that." Which kind of proved to me that the nonsense of thinking that anybody's been here forever, you know. What I wanted to do in this chapter was to look at some places. Britain's got some really brilliant and curious enclaves now. For instance, I went to Thetford. Because Thetford's fascinating. Thetford is where they made Dad's Army. It's such a British place. It's such an English place, an East Anglian market town. Thetford has a statue of Captain Mannering on the high street. What could be more English? Except a third of its population are Portuguese. Because Portuguese workers were encouraged here in the 1980s by Danepak and by Thermos. Third of its population are Portuguese. So just by that statue of Captain Mannering, if you want to talk about national identity, just by that statue of Captain Mannering, there is a lovely, brilliant cafe. I can warmly recommend it, called the Arco Iris Cafe, where you can go in and talk to the owner, who's from Porto. You can go and talk to him about Benfica and Porto and Sporting Lisbon and have a fantastic egg custard and a glass of brandy and read Portuguese newspapers. Bells Hill in Glasgow has got a Lithuanian labour club for Lithuanian workers. It's got a lot of Lithuanian people there. Quarter of the population of New Malden in Surrey are from Korea. The Filipino community in Hull grows year on year. The Yemeni community in South Shields has been there 100 years. And if you go to South Shields, you will see little blokes, swarthy blokes who clearly are of Middle Eastern stock with flat caps on going, "All right there, why, lad?" And who are Yemeni and are called things like Abdul and Oman. When I went to Thetford, by the way, I did stay in Thetford. I stayed in King's Lynn. King's Lynn's, this is an interesting thing, actually. King's Lynn used to do a lot of trade. There was a thing once called the Hanseatic League. I don't know if you know anyone in the Hanseatic League. Yeah, I preferred their early stuff before the girls joined. Thank you. The Hanseatic League were a trading partnership of us, the Dutch, and some other people. And at one point, we had so many links with the Dutch, so strong were our links with the Dutch, there were two talks. Should we just merge? Should we just merge as a country? Absolutely, seriously discussions. That two countries separated by quite a lot of water would just become the same country. It makes more sense, doesn't it? I stayed in King's Lynn. I tweeted, I said, "Where's a good place to eat in King's Lynn?" The first reply said, "London." But I found somewhere to eat. I was sitting there having a meal, and the proprietor came over and said, "I see we've got a celebrity in tonight." I thought, and I looked, and Phil Mitchell from EastEnders was at the next table. Seriously. What are the chances of that on a Tuesday night by the banks of the Great Ouse Relief Channel in King's Lynn? But there you go. He didn't have a clue who I was. The fifth chapter, the 1950s chapter, the conquering of Mount Everest. Or if you prefer, the Queen's coronation. They fell on the same day. They didn't really. The Queen, they got there 4 days before the Queen was crowned, but the news was kept back, so it looked like a double whammy, you know, for Britain. Also, we should say, point out this fantastic day, New Zealander, Nepali. No Britons got to the top of Everest till 1975. Never mind, it was a British adventure. I wanted to talk in this chapter about the British love of the outdoors, because I think that's woven into our national warp and weft. The love of adventure. We invented mountaineering. What I do like about this is it's very cross-class as well. We invented mountaineering, and the inventors of mountaineering are very, very aristocratic types, like Whymper and people like that in the Lake District, who used to climb across the walls and the ceilings of the Wasdale Head Inn. That's that little pub, that room in that pub is where mountaineering is born. And if you go to the Pen y Girid Hotel in North Wales, that's where these guys trained. And if you go there, you can see their equipment and stuff like that, and where they've written their names on the ceiling. It's fantastic. Mountaineering is quite aristocratic, although Hillary wasn't. But what I love in Britain is that you do get this combination of people like Bonington, ramrod-backed, Sandhurst men, you know, officer-class material, terribly nice man. And Don Willans, who was one of our great climbers as well, and Bonington and Willans climbed together. Willans was like Frank Sidebottom, always smoking, always talking. That's my Junkie Clark, isn't it? You know, Don Willans talked like this. All right, Chris, what have we got in here? That boiled ham left. You know, what must their expeditions have been like, you know? Work in Britain, the love of the mountains and the outdoors has a real root in working class descent. And that's why I went and retraced the Kinder Scout trespass for this book, which people again get very squeamish about what it was about. They say, oh yeah, there was some trouble over rights of way. It was a gang of committed young communists from Manchester going deliberately to have a fight with the police and the gamekeepers. It was almost not about walking at all. It was an expression of working class dissent. And songs like Ewan McCall's Manchester Rambler are about that as well. I like walking myself. On a personal note, I like walking myself. I've done all the 214 Wainwrights. The great British mountaineering writer, perhaps the doyen of British mountaineering writers, is called W.A. Poucher. By day, his day job, he was the chief perfumier for Yardley's, which I think is a lovely idea. The idea that this man, who you could find clinging by his fingernails, ice clinging to his beard, a scaling Nape's Needle on Great Gable, was also the fellow who by day put those little delicate top notes of lavender in your granny's lily of the valley that you buy her at Christmas. I love that mixture, that juxtaposition. But no, it was regarded as very odd that I did it. Now, when I first went, I didn't know anything about gear or anything like that. My first jacket, I bought £8 from the post office at Grasmere that I went fell walking in. It was so resilient and hot. By the time I got to the top of Easdale Tarn, I thought I could see Tuareg campfires in the distance. My head was swimming so much from the heat. It was... Nowadays, I'm a total gearhead. You know, I go walking in what could probably... Kate Moss probably doesn't wear an outfit as expensive when she goes to the Ivy pulling on a Friday night, is what I wear when I go in. I'm still not one of those people, though, that... and if you go walking, you know these people. All the gear, no idea, as they're called in the walking fraternity. You've got 500 pounds of Gore-Tex jacket on and trekking poles and walk from the old Keswickian Chippy in Keswick to the Moot Hall, and that's it. Clicking their way along the pavements on Bank Holiday Mondays, never going up into the hills. More irritating, though, still, at the other extreme, those people who you see when you're at the top of, say, somewhere little like Hallin Fell, and you say, oh, which way have you come? Because another thing, you talk to each other. Britons talk to each other. But why it is that the further away you get from civilization, the more British people will talk to each other. If you notice this, people on the tube never talk to each other. Go to the top of Parbold near Wigan and walk past someone and you'll nod. Go to the top of Scafell Pike and you'll stop and have a long conversation. The further away you get from civilization, the more you will talk to a stranger. It's like a rule, I've noticed. When you first take any teenagers or young people walking, the first thing they'll notice if they're of a certain age, say they're about 12 or 13, a fellow will go past you and you go, lovely day. Ah, yeah, beautiful day, yeah. I go, do you know him? You go, no. So why did you say hello to him? So what's what we're doing right walking? God, you're so weird. OMG, they are so weird and boring. I'm never doing this again. Not as irritating as the fellow when you get to the top and you say to them, which way have you come up when you're on something little like Hallingfell? Which way have you come up? And they say, oh, not far today. And then they narrow their steel blue eyes in their weather-beaten and rugged features and say, no, not far today. We bivvied in an overhang under Scale Force. Then we took Dollywagon Pike in. We came down. We went over the ridge at Whiteside. We crossed Derwentwater, mainly backstroke for the first half mile. Then we did about, I think, breaststroke for the final half mile. The dog loves that. Over the Screes, Grisdale Pike, Waller Crag, Clough Head, broke the ice at Grisdale Town to get some water. Dashed down handful of gravel, up to Patterdale, up to Angletown to rinse out the jockstrap. And then down here for a breather, we're just taking it easy here before we go on to Pennygent, Whernside, Snowdon, the Brecon Beacons, the Eiger, Mont Blanc, Catching Younger, left at the Urals, and then we're going to meet the lads at the Shepherd's Yurt for a pint of rancid yak's milk and steaming butter. How about you? And you have to say, I just came from that little ice cream van, you know, at the church. So that chapter is about adventure, and also a bit about the new Elizabethanism, because there was a great excitement in 1953 about new Elizabethanism, nuclear power, the idea that this new Elizabethan reign would see Britain come to the fore in science and technology. Ha ha! Now then, let me preface this talk a little bit about football, and we will have to speed up a little, I think, with a little bit about pork pies. Pork pie consumption in Great Britain goes up year on year. Slowly but steadily, pork pie consumption goes up year on year. Conversely, reported pork pie consumption goes slightly down year on year, which leads any of you social scientists in the room towards one inescapable conclusion, doesn't it? We are becoming a nation of covert and clandestine pork pie eaters. Because more and more people are eating them, less and less people are saying they eat them. And I would like to imagine that men, and it will be mainly men, are eating them around the back of service stations up and down the country, then going home and telling their wives that they've had rocket salad with some shaved parmesan. It is a secret vice now, the pork pie. Football is my secret vice these days. I love football. I've loved it since I was a little kid. I am not happy about telling people I love it anymore. It's become a secret vice because it has become so all-encompassing, so excessive, so ridiculous, so bloated with money, so bloated with idiotic personalities that I don't like admitting that I like it now. And like a pork pie eater, I enjoy it in secret. But enjoy it I do, and nothing is more at the heart of our national identity. For good or ill, nothing's more at the heart of our national identity, I guess, now than football. It is a shorthand by which politicians and everybody almost has to say, they have to say they like football, or they're regarded as not right, don't they? That's what I don't like about it. Everyone has to say, oh yeah, I'm passionate about football. This false passion about football really annoys me. I know lots of people who are genuinely passionate about football. This kind of idiotic passion, though, about it really annoys me. If back in the days of the 1940s and 50s, when grounds were absolutely full, when working men went in their thousands to watch football every weekend, if you had cried when your team hadn't made the play, well, there were no playoffs then, but if you had cried when your team lost a football match, the bloke next to you would have turned to you and said, what the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together. It was taken deathly seriously, but crying was for funerals and weddings and christenings and losing your job or losing a spouse, not for a football match. And I think Nat Lofthouse or Dixie Dean or desperately tries to think of a classic old Liverpool player, Tommy Smith, if they'd caught you crying, even if you'd been supporting them, you'd been crying, they'd have come up into the stand, I think, and punched you in the face themselves. And now it's this ubiquitous, sentimentalised, mawkish thing we've got about it. Having said all that, I still love it. When, at the end of last season, our great local hero in Wigan, local boy made good, Hugo Rodallega, when he scored the goal that kept us in the Premier League against Stoke, I jumped with joy. When I went to see Wigan's first game in the Premier League against Chelsea, I was, fantastically excited. Not just because Wigan were there, but because, well, Roy Hattersley says he always looks for two results every week. Sheffield Wednesday and Chelsea. See if Sheffield Wednesday's won, see if Chelsea's lost. I'm a bit like that. Because it's an old-fashioned prejudice, but they are everything that is Fancy Dan and King's Road and fur coats, aren't they, to a certain football fan. Ashley Cole at the time was at the height of his public vilification because he'd been very nasty to Cheryl, and he was at the height of my vilification because he'd written a book in which he bleated for 150 pages about the hard life of being a Premiership footballer and got a £500,000 advance for it. And apparently, when he ran past me and I was on the terraces and he kicked one of the Wigan Athletic players up into the air, apparently, I don't remember this, I shouted at him, my book's sold more than yours. Which, footballers get a lot of abuse for a lot of things, but I like to think that haunted look on his face as he walked away, and John Terry put his arm around him. I think, that bloke says his book had sold more than mine. It had. I think maybe this is where it all starts. 66. And the real hero of 66 isn't Bobby Charlton or Bobby Moore or Jeff Hurst or little toothless Nobby Stiles or Jack Charlton. The real hero of 66 is a little dog called Pickles that some of you may know about and some of you may not. We lost the World Cup in a very British show of incompetence. We lost the World Cup, or rather, we let it be stolen, the World Cup. A month before the tournament began, it was held in Britain, in England. Then, on a Sunday evening in the March of 1966, David Corbett left his ground floor flat in Norwood to make a telephone call from the kiosk across the street. A telephone call from the kiosk across the street. This very act now seems as pathetically dated as if he'd said, I'm going to pop out and be bled by apothecaries with some leeches in their hut. Or I'm going to go out and draw some water from the village well. Popped out to make a telephone call. With him was his little 4-year-old dog, Pickles. Almost immediately, something caught Pickles' attention. A tightly wrapped newspaper package lying at the side of the road next to the wheel of his neighbour's car. I picked it up, I tore some paper, I saw a woman holding a dish over her head with the words Germany, Uruguay, Brazil, and I realised I found the World Cup. It was indeed the World Cup. It had been stolen several weeks before from the Methodist Central Hall in Westminster, where it was being exhibited in a glass cabinet as part of an exhibition of rare postage stamps. No, I don't get that bit either, but we'll move on. It gets better. 5 guards had been detailed to guard the World Cup. As it was a Sunday, they'd given the one who stood right next to the glass case the day off. Margaret Coombs, who was there attending a Sunday school class, said that she had seen the thief. He had been loitering by the gents' toilet. He was little. He had jet black hair slicked back, thin lips, and a scar on his cheek, suggesting he had come straight from central casting that morning. If you look at the ITN news footage of the day, it looks fantastic. Compared to today, where everything's so spun and so manufactured. If you look at the news footage, it's basically a load of policemen and a load of security guards standing around like this, pushing their trilbies back with their thumbs. One of them says at one point, the head of the Met, I think, says at one point, "Could you give us some time, gentlemen," to the press, "to gather our somewhat scattered wits?" Can you imagine a leading policeman today saying anything like that? It's like that thing, they would use the passive voice. I'm obsessed with this. Is that the fantastic thing that, what's he called? It's always worrying when your defense secretary's called Dr. Fox anyway. But when Liam Fox said the other day, serious mistakes were made, which is that lovely use of the passive voice that all politicians use now. I didn't make them. They somehow were made. Like a 6-year-old who says, "That thing went on fire." You know. They were made passively by someone mysterious. It's a brilliant way. All politicians use that passive voice now as a way of, it just happened. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. These guys, though, don't do any of that. Just stand around going, flipping out, we've lost the World Cup. Instantly, they jump into action and think, what can we do? They try and get another one made by a silversmith in Fenchurch Street and pretend they found it again straight away, but that falls down. Because a letter arrives saying to Chelsea Football Club, the aforementioned Chelsea, "Dear Joe," no one called Joe involved in the thing. "Dear Joe, no doubt you view with very much concern the loss of the World Cup. To me, it is only so much scrap gold. If I don't hear from you by Friday, I'll assume it's one for the pot. Give me 15 grand on Friday. The cup will be back with you by cab on Saturday." And he put in, crucially, a little bit of the detachable lining of the World Cup. It was clearly genuine. So they say, right, Joe Mears, the Chelsea chairman, they get together, they arrange to meet him in Battersea Park, and they say, "We'll take you the 15 grand. What they take him is a whole bunch of cut-up newspaper with a few real notes on the top and bottom to convince him that, brilliant, you might think. Not really. He spots that it's fake newspaper straight away, and he legs it. But they catch him. He turns out to be Edward Betchley, 46, ex-soldier, previous conviction in 1954 for that classic big-time caper, receiving tins of stolen corned beef. He says, "It's nothing to do with me. I am just the middleman. I have been paid £500. The mastermind is a man known only in the underworld as the Pole." Yeah, right. He says, "If you let my girlfriend come and stay with me in prison tonight, I'll tell you where the rest of the World Cup is." And while they're thinking about it, Pickles finds the World Cup. And Pickles is the real hero of 66. He found the World Cup and he was a hero. But I've got to tell you something that will make you quite sad. Almost a year to the day afterwards, Pickles chased his next-door neighbour's cat up a tree and hung himself from the choke chain of his lead. Oh, I know, it's sad, isn't it? Only lived a year afterwards. But what a year. What a year, Pickles. It's not often I don't want to be seen to be quoting Mussolini and the fascists, but, they did say, didn't they, better to have lived a day as a lion than a lifetime as a donkey, which I know is a kind of mixed metaphor if you're talking about a dog. But Pickles, what a year Pickles had. He won Dog of the Year, won a year's supply of dog food from Spillers. Had a film made about him called A Spy with the Cold Nose. Okay, I realise I'm kind of running out of time, so maybe we should quickly talk about this. 1977, you couldn't make it up, as Richard Littlejohn is prone to say. On this one day, half the country is singing one kind of version of God Save the Queen at a trestle table eating Victoria Sponge, waving a little flag. The other half, or some of them anyway, are singing a very different kind of God Save the Queen. It sounds like an old punk whinging on, and which in some ways it is, but you cannot really convey the seismic threat to our national identity, if you like, that punk did. I wore my first pair of straight-leg trousers, because everybody wore flowed trousers in 1977. Everybody. The Archbishop of Canterbury, everybody wore big flowed trousers. David Wilkie, everybody wore big flowed trousers. When I got my first pair of straight-leg trousers, walking into Wigan to get the bus to go to Manchester and see the Clash, the entire top deck of the bus stopped and looked at me and gave me the fingers. Little old ladies. You were a pariah. You were an absolute pariah. On the television every night, people ask your kids, then you don't know what those punk rockers are, you? Because of this complete threat to our national life. And that's kind of because what the 70s were like. They were violent and conflicted times. Spain and Greece and Portugal were cheap package holiday destinations. They were also military dictatorships. Can you imagine your Auntie Susan saying to you, I was thinking of going to North Korea for 2 weeks in the summer. Planes were hijacked, pubs ran with blood. Hostage and kidnap and siege and ransom were the discourse of the day. Terrorists who looked and sounded like rock bands were ubiquitous and newsworthy and glamorous. Black September, Baader Meinhof, Brigade Rossi, Tupamaros, Shining Path, Weathermen, Black Panthers, Symbionese Liberation Army, the South Moluccans, the Angry Brigade. They were politicised times, politicised to a degree that makes our modern Britain seem as airy and disengaged as a Jane Austen novel. Conflict was our default mode. Calamity and ruin were always behind us as we queued for bread, and we queued for sugar, and we queued for petrol. The giant tectonic plates of social class buckled and ground and crashed against each other. Colossal manufacturing industries rocked and shuddered in what turned out to be their death rattle. Union leaders were A-list celebrity, clash warriors with impenetrable Scottish accent and form from the Spanish Civil War. With a wave of their hand, they could immobilise and silence the country with a motion and a block vote. The streets were dark, the mood was dark, it could all kick off at any minute. Happy days. And I do kind of think that about Happy Days, because it did make for a very vibrant and exciting national cultural life in terms of music and books and it was hard on the nerves walking home from school, stepping over unburied corpses, because the undertakers were on strike at one point, to go and eat your bird's eye potato waffles, waffly versatile by candlelight. But it was exciting. And why I talk about it here is because I think it might be the last time that the royal family were held nationally in pretty much uniform approval. There'd always been people, I think, who didn't, but this was the first real groundswell of a feeling that there were quite a lot of people who weren't that keen on the royal family, and that's what caused the problem. It was a kind of large-scale, young voice of dissent. I actually think the most Cromwellian effect, the thing that's done most to shatter a kind of consensus about the royal family in Britain, is not punk rock. It comes about a decade later, in 1986, and It's a Royal Knockout. Do you remember It's a Royal Knockout? Go and look at it on YouTube. It was organised by Prince Edward. Go and look at it on YouTube. You will think you are having a malarial dream. You'll think, is that Princess Margaret and Nerys Hughes wrestling with a plastic lobster? It is an absurd thing. And I think that may be, seriously, something that seriously added to a kind of change in the way we viewed the royal family. Certainly changed the way we view Prince Edward, who, if you look on YouTube, he gets an absolute slaughter in his press conference, or rather takes it, he did, because he'd just come out of the Marines at the time, which was an interesting notion. Anyway, I'd never found the image of Prince Edward swimming across the Straits of Murmansk at midnight with a dagger between his teeth to single-handedly overpower the crew of a Russian gunship had never quite rung true to me anyway, but... Live Aid is where modern celebrity culture begins, I think. Nearly finished. Live Aid is where modern celebrity culture begins, I think. Before Live Aid, there were celebrities. Eric and Ernie were celebrities. They got 19 million people watching their shows on Christmas Day. But they were a different kind of celebrity. The idea of going, Eric, Ernie, we really need you. We need you to help the starving children of Africa. Get Dick Emery, get Ronnie Barker. We need you to help the people of Ethiopia. It's preposterous. And yet they were major celebrities. Nowadays, it is not preposterous. It is in fact, when we think now, who should we go to save the starving children of Africa, we think Brangelina and Madonna and Bono and Chris Martin, maybe even before we think, oh, the Minister for Overseas Development. In fact, we probably don't even know who the Minister for Overseas Development is. This is where it begins, I think, and our modern obsession with celebrity culture. It changed also the live, it's the coming of music into the mainstream as well, I think. Before punk rock, only 8 years before, rock music, which I'm kind of involved in, was an outsider art, and the festival was an outsider thing. It was something. If you went to a rock festival, there was mud, there was greatcoats, there was people in balaclavas trying to sell you acid, there were girls in cheesecloth shirts, there was 13-year-old lads with bum fluff beards trying to get off with those girls, wearing Gentle Giant t-shirts. I know, I was that soldier. They were a very, very different beast. Look at the crowd at Live Aid. We don't see them there, but look at the crowd at Live Aid. They look like they've come straight from Henman Hill at Wimbledon. They are well scrubbed. They are not the counterculture anymore, and it's the beginning of pop music becoming part of this massive, all-consuming world of celebrity, I think, that now we live in. Very quick comment. I just want to tell this anecdote before we move on, because for 2 of the chapters, I had to go to Wembley. Live Aid and this, in 66. When I went to Wembley, apropos of nothing, but I just want to tell you, it's a good story. If you've read it, forgive me. When I went to Wembley, I went to Barry Cryer. I went with Barry Cryer because we were going to an awards ceremony together, and I slipped off and did my research. Barry Cryer, the famous radio and writer and comedian. And afterwards, I said to him, "What have you been done this week, Barry?" And he said, "I went to see Just a Minute. I went to do Just a Minute on Radio 4. It was brilliant." I said, "Why?" He said, "Ross Noble was on the panel, and in the bar before, Nicholas Parsons was talking to him, and he said, 'Who's your favourite comedian, Ross?' And Ross said, 'Well, that's interesting. Woody Allen, maybe. I think it's probably Richard Pryor.' And Nicholas said, 'Why is that?' And he said, 'Well, the life story is so incredible. Born in poverty in a black family in Los Angeles I can't remember if it's Compton or what. It's one of the black ghettos of Los Angeles. Mother was a prostitute. Grandmother was a prostitute. Grew up in a brothel. Alcoholic at 14. Cocaine addict at 16. Crack cocaine addict in his 30s when he made some money. Tried to freebase his own crack cocaine with a shaved-off Coke can and a Bunsen burner. Burned all his hair off. Nearly killed himself. Had a massive mental breakdown. Was found running down the street at Sunset Boulevard. Arrested by the LAPD, married 4 times, bankrupt 3 times, in prison. And yet, he's still there, and he makes this comedy, and it comes from inside him, and this pain. Wow, says Nicholas. A bit later on, Barry Cryer overhears Nicholas Parsons talking to someone else and saying, "Have you heard about Richard Bryars?" If Live Aid made politicians out of pop stars, then this is changed our politics forever, I think, and is a failed pop star who became a politician. Charles Anthony Linton Blair was in a band called Ugly Rumours with my friend Mark Allen, who played the bass. And Mark Allen will tell you quite unashamedly, Blair wanted to be a pop star. He became a politician when his career as becoming Mick Jagger failed. So he thought, well, I'll become Prime Minister instead. Which tells you whatever you think of Tony Blair, something about the man's drive and focus. He was a seismic difference from what had gone before. That's the thing. John Major was Ovaltinis and, cricket and Brill cream in your hair. This guy comes along and it's Hi Girls and cheesecloths and the Grateful Dead and things like that. It's a seismic and massive break with what went before 97. It invented modern politics. Because when I was a kid, politicians used to look different. There were big fat ones. There were quite small thin ones. There were ones with absurd eyebrows. There were women. Whatever you think of Margaret Thatcher and Edward Heath, Thatcher was a grocer's daughter. Heath's mother was a chambermaid. His dad was a carpenter. Heath would be unelectable now. Edward Heath, utterly unelectable now, because they would go, hang on, let's get this right. He laughs like that. He looks like that. He's a confirmed bachelor who plays the organ and sails yachts. He's unelectable, because the only people who are electable now are people who look like that. The one on the right. Because, no, I mean that because politics, the political class in Britain has shrunken to become white, middle-aged men in their 40s, which I think is a cause for real worry. I think the 70s were much more meritocratic and diverse and different in terms of the people who went into political life. Wilson, Thatcher, Healy, Callahan, all of these people, sailors, carpenters, Paddy Ashdown even, youth worker who was unemployed. These are being systematically excluded from our political life, I think, in favour of someone who is either a lawyer, which is probably 90%, or whatever it is David Cameron did. And I think it's not a party political point, this. It's a very worrying point for our nation, I think, that our political ruling class has shrunken to become not the Stepford wives, but the Guildford husbands. Before we finish them, the architect of New Labour wasn't this guy, though. The architect of New Labour arguably was possibly Philip Gould, or maybe Peter Mandelson, who famously, Peter Mandelson, when he was parachuted, not literally, to Hartlepool to become their MP, when he got there, he is supposed to have said in the fish and chip shop, "Ooh, I'll have some of that guacamole," pointing at the mushy peas. It gives you an idea of perhaps how out of his depth he was there. And I'll finish with just saying to you, and you can ask some questions if you like, unless Frank's going to tell me you've massively overrun. He finished, Mandelson. I know a brilliantly telling anecdote about Mandelson. I used to do a show on Radio 5 Live called The Treatment, where I got to hang out with political journalists a lot. And at one function one night with, I think, Kevin Maguire from The Mirror, or possibly Paddy Hennessy from the Daily Express, Mandelson was there, and Mandelson came over to us, not to me, to them, and said, "I've got a bone to pick with you." And I said, "Why?" He said, "You and your paper continually putting it about that I'm some kind of Svengali, that I'm some kind of Machiavellian figure, pulls strings behind the scenes. I am the Labour MP for Hartlepool. That is all I am. I'm not some puppeteer. I'm not some master of the arts of darkness who's pulling strings behind the scenes. I think this is really..." And then his phone went off. And he said, "Excuse me. Yes? Yes? This must be suppressed." And with that a whiff of irony, he came back and said, "No, where was I? Yes. I think I've massively overrun, so I think I'm going to stop. And shall we see, Frank, if anyone wants to ask me anything about anything at all? Like Sir Alistair Burnet used to say to Margaret Thatcher, finally Prime Minister, is there anything you'd like to say about anything at all?" Oh. Do I want what? Oh, shall I finish with the fall anecdote? This is just about... yeah, that might be a good place to stop unless anyone's got a burning thing to ask me. This, again, is just a brilliant example, I think, of when I love this. It tickles me the thought of what kind of person... Anyway, let me not preempt the thing. A bit like... no, that's spoil it. Mark Riley was in the Fall. Very, very angry, brilliant Manchester band, still going. 40-odd members they've had down the years, all run by this particular... run as a fiefdom by the maverick genius that is Marquis Smith. One night they're playing in Oxford. They pitch up in Oxford. They're playing at one of the Oxford colleges. They pitch up and they're having a drink in a bar, and the lad comes over and goes, "Is it the Fall?" Now, the Fall are not famous. As many of you were thinking, who the hell are the Fall? Well, no. "Is it the Fall?" "It is." And they went, "Yeah, it is." I went, "My God, it's the Fall in my local? What are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, we're playing down the road at college." "Oh my God, you're my favourite band. I've got all your albums. I can't believe this. Which college are you playing at?" And they said, "Well, whatever, Ruskin, Brazen." "Oh, the student-only gigs. I can't come. They don't like people who aren't students." "Oh, I can't believe that. My favourite band." And Mark Riley and Maggie Smith said, "Well, come in with us. You can just carry a guitar in or something like that." He said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, you can pretend you're with the road crew, and then make yourself scarce." Fantastic. Fantastic. And the guy sits and has a drink with them, then he goes in. He carries a guitar, and they go in. And he disappears into the crowd. He says, "I'll leave you now." And he goes. And they come out to play, and Mark Riley sees him very near the front. And as they're coming out, getting ready, you know. They start to play. Let's say they start to play with Bingo Master's Breakout. It might not have been, but it's one of those songs. Immediately they start to play. He goes, "Get off! Get off! You're rubbish! Get off! Call this music! Get off!" And Mark Riley looks at Marquis Smith and sort of goes, "Isn't that blow? Get off! Get off! You're rubbish!" this carries on until 2 or 3 minutes in, Mark Riley and Mikey Smith can take it no more and jump off into the stairs, and he runs away, and he runs out into the night, and they never see him again. Now, I like to think that there's some almost a Dali-esque comic genius there at work who's in his pub on a Tuesday night in Oxford. Oh, this is boring. Oh, look, there's the fall. All right, I think I could have... Right, let's really go mess with the fall's head. Gets his drink and what's... Because what other explanation is that? I think that's genius. I think there is a kind of macabre genius about that, yeah. Should we stop there? Yeah. Well,